Welcome to part 2, where we look at Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, the Patriarchs. We began in part 1 with the whole creation, in its immensity, in its amazingness. And now we're narrowing down to one family. It's as if the focus has shifted right down from the immensity of creation to this one family, the family of Abraham, the family of promise, that through Abraham all nations will be blessed. And yet, in truth, this is a dysfunctional family. And yet it shows that God can even work through dysfunctional people. So, on to Abraham. Thank you. In our explanation of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, the patriarchs, in this part 2 of our exploration of the Old Testament, there is so much information. There are so many stories, some familiar, some not so familiar, and we can't possibly cover them all. So I do encourage you to read the book of Genesis. It reads like a thriller, and it's very important to understand just what's going on. Well, the timeline. We finished in part 1 with the family of Terah moving from Ur of the Chaldees, to Haran. And then in chapter 12 of Genesis, we have this amazing call of God to Abraham. Now, we have to assume that Abraham didn't know anything about God, that the knowledge of God had disappeared, had gone, in the midst of all the other gods that were in the nations around. And yet this mysterious God calls to Abraham and says to him to leave the security of Haran, buy a tent, basically, become a nomad, and move into Canaan, which will be the land that God will give to Abraham and his descendants forever. And so Abraham, in obedience, does exactly that and sets off. And so the story moves on. Well, Abraham does end up in Egypt very early on, because Egypt was perhaps more settled than any other part of the Fertile Crescent. Abraham was 75 years old when he was called, and through the beginning of his line, Isaac and Jacob, 430 years later, they end up in Egypt. And that is the end of the Genesis account and the beginning of the Exodus account. Now, I can only pick out certain things, otherwise this part will go on for a long time. God's call to Abraham, I've just talked about. But not only was the call, God gave a covenant to Abraham, and we'll cover that in more detail a few slides further on. Eventually, God keeps his promise, and a son is born to Abraham and Sarah, though they are without child and they are extremely old. But when the lad's about 12 years old, God commands him to sacrifice his son. You can't begin to imagine what that must have meant, the confusion, and yet he's going to be obedient to it until God stays his hand. Isaac eventually has 2 sons, Esau and Jacob. But Esau sells his birthright to Jacob. 2 sons are twins. And so the story continues as Jacob's story. Jacob has 12 sons, and one of the sons takes on the line, and that's Joseph's story. And we end Genesis with the death of Joseph and his request for his body to be taken with them when the family eventually set off back again for the promised land. So important at this point just to remind us that Abraham is one small family, Bedouin family, travelling around the deserts and around the areas of Canaan, in the midst of a great upheaval where the empires are beginning to change. I call it tectonic plates. But what we're seeing in the book of Genesis is sacred history. There is much history going on, but this is history of God leading his people and working his purposes out through history itself. Covenants were an important part of national life at that time. There were many covenants, usually between a conquering king and those he'd conquered. And they would have to pay obeisance to him. He would exact taxation from them, but he would say in the covenant that if you keep my rules, regulations, I will bless you. But if you break them, I will punish you. But this covenant between God and Abraham again is between the great king and the servant. And God says that he will bless Abraham and fulfill his promises. But if Abraham breaks that, then there will be punishment. And God promises that he will never, ever break the covenant. And there are several covenants in the Bible, but the thread that goes through them is that God is always faithful to those covenants. And if we look at the covenants in the Old Testament, we see that the nation of Israel breaks them again and again and again. God punishes them, he forgives them and restores them. And that will become a theme as we go through this Old Testament exploration. Interesting points from the story of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob are covered here. And again, I will just comment briefly on them. The promise of a son, of course, is a miracle because he is 75 years old when the promise is made, and Sarah is not much younger. He is 100 when Isaac is actually born. But even through all the ups and downs and the mistakes and the wrong turnings, Abraham seems to hang on to that promise, though mayhem is created at times as well. And so it can be said, as it is in chapter 15 verse 6, that Abraham put his trust in the Lord, and because of this the Lord was pleased with him and accepted him. So the long journey is beginning to salvation. The promise of the covenant, of course, Abraham is still waiting, and it's 24 years before God fulfills that, and Sarah has this child of promise, Isaac. But one of the things that's happened beforehand is that at Sarah's suggestion, Abraham takes the promise into his own hands by having a child by his wife's servant. That was very common in Mesopotamian times, that a servant could be used as a surrogate if the wife couldn't have children. And but that son, Ishmael, is cast out when Isaac's born. But interestingly enough, in Islam, the legitimate son is seen as Ishmael himself, and of course is partly to just illuminate the conflict that goes on between the Arab and the Jewish nations. The sacrifice of Isaac is one of the important stories because it illustrates the Jesus story, that what God did not require from Abraham, he was willing to do himself. And they journeyed to Mount Moriah, which later became the site of the temple in Jerusalem. Here's the family tree of Abraham. We see that Esau is off to one side, the son of Isaac and Rebekah, but he sells his birthright to the younger brother, and Jacob becomes the line through which we're traveling. And Jacob has 12 sons, not all by his 2 wives, but again by 2 servants as well. And but the important story continues with the story of Joseph, the well-known story of Joseph being sold into slavery in Egypt and becoming the Pharaoh's right-hand man. Of course, by that point, the Egypt was a settled state under a stable dynasty. Point us to Jesus. Well, the call of Abraham is very much cited by Stephen in his speech before his stoning to death, and he says that the faith that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had, they wouldn't have treated Jesus in the way that the Jewish leaders did. And of course, the sacrifice of Isaac, which God did not require. Paul tells us that he who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all. And the contrast is made that the Abraham and Isaac sacrifice is seen as a foreshadowing, but a turning over of what will happen in the life of Jesus himself. And so the early Christians began to understand a little bit more about why God had allowed Jesus to suffer in the way that he did. Here's an aside, and you can skip over this, but in chapter 14 we have this mysterious figure, Melchizedek. We don't know anything about him before or after, but we have this encounter between Abraham. Now, one of the things that the Jewish Christians probably wrestled with was the fact that of calling Jesus our great high priest. Well, he wasn't of the priestly family of Levi, but the writer to Hebrews points back before Abraham and says, here is this figure, Melchizedek, this great high priest, who Abraham offers a tithe to as his superior. So he's saying there is a priesthood that is superior to the priesthood of Levi, and that's the priesthood that Melchizedek is pointing towards, the priesthood of Jesus, our great high priest. And so Jesus, the perfect priest, took himself as the perfect sacrifice into the very presence of God in heaven, thus removing the need for temple and animal sacrifices forever. Well, of course, on Gentile Christians who weren't, whose whole being was not tied up in this understanding of temple and sacrifice, probably wouldn't quite understand. But of course, the writer is writing to Jewish Christians. So, the journey we call sacred history, covered by the whole Bible, has begun. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob became the heirs of the promise that their descendants would become a great nation and would inherit the land God had promised them. The important thing to say is that part of that promise is that because they would become a great nation, they were to be a blessing to the whole world. In other words, bring the whole world back to God. And in that, they failed. And you can see the failure of it as we go through the Old Testament. And so it was important to God to then bring that back in again, because the whole tenor of the gospel accounts is that go into all the world and make disciples of all nations, to actually fulfill in the new covenant, the new Israel, what the old Israel failed to do by keeping God exclusively to themselves and not sharing his love with others. And so we leave Genesis with the family of Jacob settled in Egypt, as of course Joseph brings his family to live with him under a benign Pharaoh. But that soon turned into a captivity and slavery when the Pharaoh changed. But more of that in our next part, where we look at Moses and the Exodus. So thank you. Hope this hasn't been too much a rush through, but hopefully not too long, but will have whet your appetite to read the Genesis account. Thank you.